Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode, landlord is jealous of my income, raises my rent $500. I screw him years later for $20,000. After that, don't fire me so you can hire your nephew. Finally, killed a tow company with one simple phone call. Before we get into today's episode, remember to subscribe so you never miss another episode of r/ProRevenge. Landlord is jealous of my income, raises my rent $500. I screw him years later for $20,000. In the late 90s, wife and I were just married, just getting started, and we decided to dink. Double income, no kids, it for a few years to save up for a down payment on a house. The dot-com bubble was still rising and I was a newly minted software developer. I had an entry-level job for a while and then got recruited to a new city and a new job that paid 3x what I was making before. It was an offer too good to pass up. I ran the numbers and it was a no-brainer. By living frugally and saving my entire salary, living off just her income, we would easily have enough in a year to put 20% down payment on a new house. We rented an apartment in the new city that was listed for $950. No. The landlord was a real estate agent who owned a 2-bedroom condo as an investment property. Let's call him Hank Wazowski. Hank was a thin, grey, no-nonsense guy. He was pleasant enough, but perfunctory, dry, and had no sense of humor. He made a point of explaining that under no circumstances was he responsible for maintaining the garbage disposal and that it was not included in the rental agreement and he would not be responsible for fixing it were it to break. Okay. He seemed slightly amused by us, a clueless, young, newlywed couple, but I could tell he wanted to rent to us, because we were very obviously a safe choice as renters. We filled out the rental agreement and the credit check, and this is where my troubles began. Hank looked hard at the credit application where I listed my job title, software developer, and my income, $75,000. For a 23-year-old in his second year out of college, in the late 1990s, this is a small fortune. Throw in my wife's salary and we were over 6 figures in income, renting an apartment far beneath our means. Like I said, dink is the way to go when starting out. I can't believe how much money you make, Hank must have said half a dozen times, muttering under his breath. I explained we were saving to buy a house and that we were only going to stay in the apartment a year. We might stay a few months after the term is over. Would month to month be okay after a year? Hank assured us that would be fine. We saw Hank only once during the year and he again mentioned my salary and how he couldn't believe that's what software developers were making. It was awkward and I gave a vague reply. Anyway, a year later we had found a house to buy, signed all the papers, and were making plans to move. The new house wasn't going to be ready until 2 months after our rental lease was up, so I called Hank to ask if we could, as discussed, simply extend the lease by 2 months before moving out. Hank assured me on the phone it would be no problem and he would send over an extension for us to sign. The extension arrived in the mail and it included a month-to-month clause and a $500 increase in the rent. I flipped out and called him. Hank, why are you increasing the rent over 50%? That's too much. That's more than my new mortgage is going to be. He was super condescending to me. Rocky Moose, it's what the apartment goes for now. I would be losing money by renting it for less. I tried to reason with him, but it was very clear he knew we could afford the $500, had no choice in the matter, and he was going to screw us over as best he could. He got angry with me for arguing my point, and I'll never forget his parting words. You don't have to like it, Rocky Moose, you just have to pay it. My wife and I tried to figure out a way to move out early by putting our furniture in a storage for a couple months and crashing with friends, but it just wasn't going to work out. I swallowed my pride and wrote out the check for $1,450 for the extra month. A month later I wrote a similar check, and then we moved out. I made sure the apartment was spotless before moving, but still Hank withheld $300 from our security deposit for bullet things that were just a way for him to squeeze a few more dollars from the kids who made too much money. $100 for cleaning, sure, but $300 was obscene. In my mind, he had screwed me over $4,1,200 and there was nothing I could do about it. What made us even more infuriating is that I saw the ad Hank put in the paper after we moved out and he listed the apartment for rent at only $150 more than we had been paying originally, not the grossly inflated $500 increase. And it didn't rent. A month later I saw the same ad and he had lowered the price to $75 more than we had been paying, and I assume it got rented since the ad stopped appearing. Fast forward about 5 years. Life is good, the house is good, we have a baby, and even though the dot-com bubble has burst, I'm still employed. One day, out of the blue, I overhear one of my co-workers, Phil, a senior developer, talking to the guy working the reception desk. "Hey, Mike, I'm expecting someone to drop off some paperwork for me. If a Hank Wazowski asks for me, tell him I'll be right out." I freeze and get a taste of bile in my mouth remembering how I had to write out that name on those checks all those years ago. There's no way it's the same guy, right? I walk over to Phil who is still by the reception desk. "Phil," I say, "how do you know that name? Hank Wazowski?" Phil explains that Hank is his real estate agent. "I bought my condo through him several years ago. I'm selling my condo now so I can buy a house. So I'm going to ask him to be my agent again. Do you know him?" I tell Phil that I used to rent an apartment from Hank and described what he looks like. Phil confirms the description. It's the same guy. Wow, small world, right? And on cue, right then the front door to the office opens and in walks Hank Wazowski. I stare in disbelief. He's carrying a folder of papers and doesn't recognize me. Phil and Hank shake hands and they talk for a few moments. I stand there silently, wondering what to do. Phil finally says, "Hank, this is my friend Rocky Moose. I think you may have already met." "Yes, hello Hank. Good to see you again. My wife and I were your tenants a few years ago on Street. Remember, the software developer who rented for a year saving to buy a house? Well, this is where I work. Here. With Phil." Hank's eyes indicate he now remembers me, and he's starting to put it all together. We shake hands and he says yes, of course he remembers and asks how we are doing. "Oh, we're just fine. Thanks for asking." Phil says that you're his real estate agent. Small world, isn't it? Hank nods pleasantly. He still doesn't remember the details of our last conversation. I do some quick math in my head. This is the early, mid-2000s. The real estate market is very strong and easy money for any agent. The crash of 2008 is still a few years in the future. I start to think out loud. Selling the condo for around $150 to $200,000, and you're looking at houses in the $500,000 range, so that's $650 to $700,000 inches total transactions. An agent getting 3% on the sale and the purchase is getting around $20,000 for his trouble. That's a good commission for the agent, isn't it? Hank's eyes flash and I can tell he remembers everything about me now. Phil is surprised at my passive-aggressive tone. I am enjoying the uncomfortable silence. Hank deflects my question, saying it's complicated, and tells Phil to send back the papers as soon as possible. He shakes hands with Phil, looks at me, nods, and goes to leave. "It was really good to see you again, Hank," I call behind him. He exits the building. As the door is still shutting, I say a bit too loudly, so that Hank can hear, "Phil, don't sign anything just yet. I have a story to tell you." Phil looks at me and says, "Rocky, what the hell was that all about?" He looks pissed and confused at my behavior. I tell Phil the whole story. The rent, the $500 increase, the security deposit. You don't have to like it, you just have to pay it, everything. "Phil, you can't use this guy to sell your condo and buy a house. I hate him. He's evil. I'll help you find another real estate agent. Just use anyone, but Hank." So the great thing about Phil is that, well, he's a great guy. He says he's a little surprised at my story and has always known Hank as a straightforward guy. "But I totally see him doing that to you," he admits. "There's no way I could use him now." What a dong. Then Phil's eyes lit up a bit. "What do you want me to say when I fire him?" I have special feelings for Phil now. We came up with a plan and I made sure there were some key phrases in Phil's repertoire. We planned it all out together in advance. My only regret is that I didn't get to see Hank's reaction in person a day later when Phil made the following phone call while I stood behind him listening. "Hi, Hank. It's Phil calling. Yeah, about that. I've decided to get some other quotes from other agents. I'm not going to sign up with you." Pause. No, you shouldn't give a discount. You'd be losing money if you did that. Pause. No, this is just a decision I've made. No, it has nothing to do with Rocky Moose. Pause. Well, you don't have to like it, Hank. You just have to accept it. Goodbye. Click. And it was the greatest revenge I could have ever imagined. Through a chance meeting years later, Hank got screwed out of $20,000 in easy commissions. And the best part is Hank absolutely knew it had everything to do with Rocky Moose. Don't fire me so you can hire your nephew. This happened several years ago. I was working for a small medical supply company as the IT manager. Business was bad and eventually the IT department had to downsize to just me. During this time they brought in a new CFO that I had to report directly to. Let's call her Pam. Pam had zero knowledge of IT and how things worked. Her motto was if it ain't broke don't fix it. PC, server lifecycles didn't exist. We don't have to pay for licensing to keep our firewall updated. It's working just fine now. I went from having an annual budget to a wish list which she would deny everything I asked for. The couple that owned the company were real pieces of it too. One time we had a quarterly meeting and people were asking about how secure their jobs were. The owners said that nobody was getting laid off and that our jobs were all secure. This was at 5 PM on a Wednesday. The very next morning at 9 o'clock they laid off 6 people. At noon one of the owners showed up to show off the Escalade that he had just purchased that morning. During the first 6 months that Pam was there she started firing everyone that worked for the old CFO and replaced them with her friends and family. 3 of her bridesmaids from her wedding a few years prior got hired to replace those that she fired. I knew I was on borrowed time. After she had been there for 9 months I was the only one left out of what was about a dozen people that worked for the old CFO. I knew my time was running out. I had been looking for work, but the 2009 crash just happened and the job market in my area went south quickly. Sure enough she called me into HR and blindsided me with an entirely trumped up charge that she claimed happened the day before. I was working with the VP of sales on a project that entire day so I had a witness. I asked to bring him in since my boss was lying and was told this is not about him, this is about you. Remember kids, HR is there to protect the business, not do what is right or legal in some cases. Needless to say I knew my days were numbered. The next morning I get introduced to an IT expert who just happens to be Pam's 21-year-old nephew. He was to shadow me and evaluate everything that I did to see if we could streamline any processes. In other words, they wanted me to train him to do my job. I quickly learned that this kid had absolutely no knowledge of IT. He's the kid people think is an IT expert because he can hook up a PlayStation to a TV. He didn't even know how to join a PC to a domain. So I knew what had to be done. The inventory, billing and shipping and receiving were all run by scripts that I created on the server. They were all run using the domain admin account. I raised quite a fuss about giving him the domain admin account in front of Pam and him. I then loudly proclaimed that I was going to change the password to it since you can't have people who don't work for the company to have admin access to our network. I was overruled and was told to give it to him. I complied, but I also showed him multiple times how to change passwords on the domain. I even had him write it down to make sure that he could do it. I really stress the importance of changing the admin password and deleting his local account the second he is no longer consulting with us to him. I showed him a few things, but nothing in regards to what really made the company run. That day, there wasn't enough time in a year to bring this kid up to speed on how to run that place due to his complete ignorance of IT. I come into work the next day and sure enough I was let go, because her nephew had found my skills lacking in many areas. I collect my last paycheck and head home. The next morning I get a call from the CFO and owners. Apparently her nephew wasn't quite up to speed on everything we did there, and she was graciously offering to pay me my regular salary to come in as a consultant and get her nephew up to speed on the IT infrastructure. I told her that I was now an independent contractor, and if she wanted my services I was going to charge her $200 per hour with a 250-hour minimum. At that point she told me that she was going to call the police and have me arrested for what I did if I didn't come in and fix everything. My response was just so we're clear, you fired me, replaced me with a completely unqualified idiot, and now you're threatening to call the cops on me if I don't come in and fix what he did? I'll hold. Please call the police and let me know what they said. She started cursing at me and hung up the phone. Turns out her nephew did actually learn something from me. He changed the admin password after I had left. The one that ran all the scripts for inventory, billing, shipping and ordering. According to some of my co-workers, the place was dead in the water for several days until they could get a real consultant in to go through the documentation that I had created and fix the issue. The nephew was immediately fired and Pam was gone within a month. Killed a tow company with one simple phone call. I killed an entire tow company with one phone call. On mobile. So bear with me. Several years back I went to work for a towing company. It's about all I know how to do other than paint cars, which is drastically affecting my health. The pay was pretty decent, but we had to share trucks and the boss felt that he knew where we needed to sit in order to get the best calls. This is important for later. Several months in, I realized that I was not making the type of money that I should be making. So I took the opportunity while I was sitting in a parking lot one evening to start researching the laws pertaining to employees in similar positions. He was kind of an AOA and the trucks had transponders so that he could see if we had them idling with the air conditioner on on a hot day, or idling with the heat on a cold day. He was always calling complaining about something if the wheels were not turning. During my research I discovered that if he was requiring us to sit in a certain parking lot, street, or any location of his choosing, then we were entitled to be paid an hourly wage, not just our commission. The technical term was engaged to wait. However, if he allowed us to freely roam about while we waited for calls, we were not entitled to hourly wages and we were therefore considered waiting to be engaged. I never mentioned this to him, but I did start taking note of my time. Another month or so goes by and he decided to start coming down on me for tiny little BS. Things that ordinarily wouldn't even matter, such as I forgot a pop can in the cup folder. He actually had a screaming fit about that. At this point I was tired of working there and had already found another job, so I decided it was time to put my plan into motion. I called him up, told him that we needed to have a conversation about my final wages and that we could meet at his convenience. Upon entering the office I laid out my argument, explained the state law, and told him I expected to be paid for the hours that I was on the clock, but not freely allowed to roam looking for work or able to do things of my choosing. He told me in no uncertain terms would not be paid for that time, as that was agreed to upon my employment. I did not bother to argue, as I already had my next step planned, so I took my final check and I left. The following Monday, I made a phone call to the State Labor Board, where I laid out my case to them. Needless to say, they were very interested in what was going on. In the end, they came to review his employment records and speak to the drivers still working. When he got the bill of what he had to pay us all, it was too much for him to afford, so he sold the trucks, his boat, and lot and went out of business. I never got the money owed to me in full, only a fraction. But the satisfaction of knowing the law just a little bit better than he did and watching it all burn was pure bliss.